Nice might be a little bit of a stretch for a blue dragon, but where other dragons gather handfuls of fearful minions, blues command armies, often loyal ones. They are tyrants, but not always to their closest servants, and never needlessly. Today's deep dive into personality, lairs, battle tactics, and allies will give you everything you need to make blue dragons into true tyrants, bringing kingdoms into their power and maybe your player characters. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Timothy, though some people do call me Tim. I've been DMing for almost 3 decades and run over 1,000 games of 5th edition D&D in the last 4 years alone. Usually 7 games a week. So let's dive into blue dragons, eh? After I fix my shelf from the true tyrant, my cats. Seriously, you can leave them standing, buddy. It's okay. Cats. Like most chromatic dragons, blue dragons have a healthy dose of pride and greed. But they don't show it in the same way. Because where black dragons crave fear and ruin, and white dragons are hunting for survival and food, blue dragons are looking for control, respect, and followers. A blue does not want to be hidden away and left alone. They want to be revered and feared. This makes a blue dragon the most likely dragon to stop by to tell you its name, if only so you can show the proper respect. And they're one of the dragon types most likely to play well with others too. They can be loyal, if only temporarily, and they don't needlessly or carelessly betray others, only if it will benefit them. Because of their desire for followers, a blue is unusually willing to spend the treasure that they obtain. A blue's loot should, because of this, in part be found upon its minions. And those minions can indeed be truly loyal. They're not just afraid of their boss, though they are. They have been tested and rewarded for their loyalty, carefully selected and indoctrinated by their smooth-talking tactician of a boss. Speaking of being a tactician, blue dragons view themselves most frequently as emperors or generals, the top dog, lord of all they see. Though they're not shy like a green dragon, and more than willing to get into the thick of things when it's needed. The worst part of facing a blue dragon as a party of adventurers is that they are unlikely to do it alone. They lead their minions wisely, deploying forces when needed and only adding their own might when it is to their greatest advantage. This means that most combat encounters with the blue should only encounter after your group has already engaged with their minions, or more likely while you're still engaged with them. Although they spend a lot of their wealth on building up their forces, blue dragons are not above the lure of treasure that is so characteristic of dragons. They just don't like boring or useless loot. Anything commonplace or flawed is expendable. Common gems or boring magic items should end up in the hands of their loyalists. Meanwhile, only the cream of the crop or magic items that aid in their empire building should end up in the blues' personal hoard. One-of-a-kind items, regalia of rulership, or maybe paintings of subjugated kings and queens would be some treasure examples. In magic items, tools like the Horn of Silent Alarm, sending stones for communication with distant outposts, or the vaunted Rod of Rulership would be suitable items. Or perhaps items that summon expendable troops, like the sensor of controlling air elementals, which is particularly choice for blue. One thing is clear, common +1 items shouldn't be laying around their lair when they could be placed upon the honor guard that protects it. Speaking of lairs, blue dragons favor deserts and badlands, but they also favor places that make them feel powerful or important. Usually the descriptive word for a blue dragon's lair's location would be epic. Ancient monoliths or monuments built in the blue dragon's honor, reclaimed palaces or giants' strongholds, fallen skyships, or the seat of power of an ancient kingdom. They would probably contest for territory with black dragons if it wasn't for the blues' preference for arid territory over wetlands. They also bring their empire-building mindset to their lair choices. They will select their lairs with troop placement and defense in mind. And they won't neglect the option to leave a place for themselves to sit above it all, where their minions can revere them and they can see approaching forces from far off. And adult and ancient blue dragons can uniquely pull this off, but we'll talk about that later. Typical features of a blue dragon's lair include troops, sand, and strategy. When it comes to the troops of their lair, a blue dragon's lair might just be the most crowded of dragon kind. Before we talk about who might be found there, though, let's talk about how you might encounter them. In an ideal lair, outposts of guards will ring a blue dragon's territory. They'll also be stationed strategically throughout it. Battles with the blue dragon will far more often be a battle with its troops punctuated by a sudden blast of lightning from out of nowhere than some kind of solo boss against the general himself. Coupled with blue dragon's high CR, this can make them particularly challenging foes. A blue dragon will be willing to hit its troops with its breath weapon in combat, but unlike a black or a red dragon, won't do so unless it's absolutely necessary. It will be a tactical decision, not an uncaring one, which can be an opportunity for players to limit the amount of lightning they get hit with by using the dragon's troops as personal shields. In addition to a variety of troops, sand is a surprisingly versatile tool in a blue dragon's lair. Loose sand can provide difficult terrain or make climbing between one tier and another virtually impossible. It can also be held back and released in a flood to block tunnels or bury intruders. Given their breath weapons, blue dragons might also turn sand into glass for even more versatility. A blackened, glassy floor that has weak patches over the top of pools of quicksand would be a pretty nasty obstacle to cross over against entrenched troops. And glassy ceilings could easily be shattered at a strategic moment in order to bring the roof down. Once again, older dragons are particularly prepared to use this kind of tool, but we'll break that down in their tactics section. Blue dragons' lairs will also have a lot of strategic features, because their preparations will also extend to building appropriate fortifications in their lairs. Arrow slits, trenches, reinforced doors with easy-to-grab bars, winch-driven portcullises, and winding tunnels with easy burrow points for the dragon to burst through. These are the kind of things that these brilliant strategists will include in their lair building in order to defend their homes. And then there's the mystical influence of adult and ancient dragons within 1 mile of their lair. Unfortunately, that influence in this case is underwhelming at best and confusing at worst. The first one has a 1 in 20 chance of creating a 20-foot to 80-foot deep sinkhole when somebody dares to rest within 1 mile of the lair. But the question is, what, by the rules, is a sinkhole? And the answer is darned if I know. If you do, let me know in the comments. Is it just a hole and they fall into it and take a few d6 of damage? That seems to be the case. And frankly, if that is the case, then it might just be the worst regional effect of any dragon. And the second ability just adds light obscurement within 1 mile of the lair. And it's a double-edged sword, affecting both the dragon and its allies as well as its enemies. Despite these lair features being kind of unfortunate, they are awesome from a narrative standpoint. The narrative image of pockmarked terrain, of sinkhole-infested sands, with whirling dusts and thunder roiling overhead, sets a pretty awesome backdrop for your adventure there. You can lean into it by building encounters where the dragon seeds lightning into the clouds, or ranged troops use large sinkholes as a terrain element to keep the party at a distance, a tactic that can be pretty effective. And speaking of tactics, let's talk dragon tactics, starting with Wormling and Young Dragons, because their stat blocks are basically identical with just some increases to the numbers. Universally, blue dragons have solid armor class and hit points for their CR. And in addition to flying around with blind sight, they can burrow. Their burrowing doesn't mention tunneling, so they don't leave a path behind them when they dig. And they can't dig through solid stone. But this is still very useful for escapes, with one caveat. And for ambushes, also with one caveat. First, Escapes. Movement speeds under the current rules work that if you have spent X from one movement, then you have spent that same amount from all your other modes of movement. Since burrow is the blue's lowest speed, this means you have to take care not to use too much of, say, your flying speed before you attempt to burrow, or you might not have any speed left to do so. For ambushes, you don't run into that same problem because you're going to be spending your burrowing speed first, but blue and white dragons both have the same problem in that though they can burrow, they lack tremor sense. Since blind sight doesn't work if your target is behind any kind of total cover, like a couple of feet of sand, this means you're digging blind. Blues overcome this with their big brains, by planning their digging before they burrow, of course. But on the battlefield, remember that means while the blue is under the earth, it doesn't know what is happening up above. When they find you though, watch out. Blues are powerful in melee. But unlike some dragons, their breath weapon actually scales really well at all age categories. 2+ targets is almost always worth using your breath over your melee options. And even if you could only get one target in your breath weapon, it's usually worth it if that target has a particularly high armor class, or you can somehow get them to get disadvantage on their dexterity saving throws. When blue dragons grow up and become adults, they get a whole new bag of tricks. Unfortunately, from adult to ancient, there's no new tricks, but I guess we can't have everything. Naturally, adult and ancients get legendary resistance, 3 when they're on the prowl, or 4 in their lair, unless you edit that number like I do. Anyway, like all but white dragons, blue dragons get spellcasting when they become adults. And they can trade one specific spell into their multi-attack. In this case, Shatter. Unfortunately, Shatter, with its 10-foot radius of thunder damage, doesn't really measure up well when compared to the dragon's claws, though it does have one very strong redeeming quality. On the bad front, you must hit at least 2 targets, and preferably 3, in order to make up the damage you're losing from not taking a swipe with those claws. This is true for adults with their level 2 Shatter, and for ancients with their upgraded level 3 one. And since it's thunder and not lightning damage, a blue dragon can't safely drop this within their own space, which is a great argument for fighting in underneath the dragon's legs if you're a player character. However, the best part of Shatter is what it can do to unattended objects, especially fragile crystalline ones, like glass created from sand being repeatedly blasted with lightning breath, perhaps? Within the dragon's lair, glass can now become a temporary barrier that can be shattered in the middle of combat to drop down a roof, open up or end a tunnel, or let people get dumped down into quicksand. All with one spell in the middle of an attack routine while you're ripping someone else apart. Use this to bury or restrain party members, separate them, block off their escape, or enable your own. Meanwhile, they get a few other at-will spells: Mage Hand, Detect Magic, and Invisibility. Since both Invisibility and Detect Magic require concentration, it's harder for blues than it was for blacks to justify always having concentration spent on Detect Magic to know what kind of loot the party is carrying. But if they're going to make an appearance to parlay with the group, it might be best for them to do so with that ability turned on. A blue will want the knowledge so that they can make a plan for how to best defeat your party. It also offers a very minor option for burrow ambushing. By laying or burrowing less than 1 foot beneath the sand, a Detect Magic spell can detect through that barrier in order to see when somebody has stepped right into the danger zone. But that's all assuming that you're not using invisibility for your ambushes, which you probably will. Invisibility also adds primarily to the blue dragon's ability to gather information. Lounging or flying outside of their lair invisibly, they will see anyone who is approaching, but they won't be seen in return. The sound of their wings beating overhead might be heard by your party when they come by to check on them, if it decides to get that close, but it can still remain an unseen threat that ratchets up tension without ever rolling a die. This also makes an ambush pretty easy to pull off, and allows the dragon to stay out of combat until its appearance will have the most effect. While Mage Hand will probably not ever be your go-to, if you've set up Portcullis or other triggerable effects within a blues lair, it might be a fun option to cast the spell just to pull the lever and have the blues Machiavellian laughter rolling through the place while whatever happens, happens. Less frequently available, older blues have access to scrying and sending once per day. And the lack of material component needed for scrying is actually pretty awesome. These spells continue to allow a blue to be the master of gathering information and passing out as needed. If you really want to lean into that in an unusual way, then have the dragon fly around invisibly following the party all day. See where they camp, and then when they leave, drop down and steal their poop. Not their stuff, their actual poop.
What?
It at least qualifies as a possession, even if it's arguable whether or not it's a body part as much as, say, fingernail clippings were, or a discarded piece of hair. Anyway, scry away on these troublemakers, especially when they're fighting your outermost minions. And really, these are pretty much just ways to justify the almost omniscient knowledge that these blue dragons will be able to gather compared to other dragons. A blue should always seem prepared, and should make changes to its defense strategy depending upon who is invading. Sending adds to this, allowing the dragon to organize or warn its forces, or to communicate directly with the party without putting itself in harm's way. But once they're in harm's way, well, then it's time for legendary actions. Their tail swipe, though allowing them to add an extra attack, doesn't give movement like some other dragon's pounce ability does. So if you want to crank up the damage that your dragon is dishing out, they need to stay within reach of their opponents. This can be risky. You do not want to get caught within range of a bunch of your opponents. Blues are too good for that. But their next legendary action helps. Cloak Flight not only gives you the ability to move half of your flying speed, but also to immediately cast the invisibility spell once again. This is kind of huge. You can only do it once per round, but swooping away from the melee types that are trying to get to you, if you can't get behind total cover, and not being able to be seen by spellcasters who might require sight in order to deliver their spells, is a big boon. And their final option, Sonic Boom, is a chance to cast Shatter without losing out on your melee potential. If you've seeded your lair with glass breakables, this is the best time to break them, so that you don't have to give up a rend attack, or stay within melee range for a tail swipe. Otherwise, it's basically just a little extra damage when you're at range. Tactically, you're typically looking at one of two strategies. Either you'll be staying away from the party, hitting them with your breath weapon and legendary action Shatter before using Cloak Flight to slip away, waiting then for your breath weapon recharge. Perhaps casting Shatter again on your turn if you're feeling particularly tough or you have some total cover with which to hide behind. But honestly, it might be better to spend your action doing a stealth check in order to try and fly as silently as possible to a new position. Or you'll be looking to smash the party with your melee might. If that's the case, use your turn to get into position on a likely target, preferably one that has acted just before you in the initiative or won't act for quite a while. Rend them as much as possible, and after each turn, tail slap the same guy. If your prey gets moved out of reach, shatter them. If someone dangerous is about to act, then use your Cloak Flight to get away. Blues, more than probably any other dragon, require a close attention to the initiative order in order to be as successful as possible. They're master tacticians, so these tiny moments between people's actions are opportunities to be exploited for them. And don't forget, as the general of an army, you won't be fighting alone, because a blue dragon starts collecting minions from day one. Even wormlings will try to tempt or talk people into their service. They will generally be intelligent types motivated by money or power, or both. Both is good. Their minions are generally humanoids or other bipeds, with hobgoblins making a strong case for the title of most likely minion. Their warlike nature makes them perfect soldiers, and perhaps ideal servants for the dragon. And mechanically, they're pretty helpful too. With both ranged and melee attacks in their stat blocks, they make great infantry, and their leader's aura of authority can make a blue's attacks almost unerring. Throw in some bugbear allies to grapple targets and keep a blue's armor class from being tested too fully, and you've got the beginnings of an army any blue dragon would be proud of. With their desert and storm themes, Jinn and air elementals are also likely allies, ones that can weather a dragon's spells and breath weapon. Throw in an elemental cultist or two, some dust mephits, and a conquered tribe of desert nomads, and you've got yourself a kingdom. So, if you've got yourself a kingdom, how can you turn it into a campaign? Blue dragons are always seeking more power. At first, it's gathering a small group of loyalists. Then it's subjugating a village or carving a home in ancient ruins. Eventually, they move on to shadowy criminal networks or small kingdoms. But after a few centuries, they're going to start thinking about intergenerational power at the head of a sprawling kingdom. Or, world domination. And you can totally run them as the big bad evil guy for your campaign by starting them right there. Design the kingdom that your dragon rules over and start having their influence affect your characters' lives from day one. Perhaps they're invading a neighboring kingdom, the one where your characters live. Or they're hiring adventurers to do the dirty work that their minions can't do, especially if they're monstrous. This is the route that I'd take. Hire the party and pay them well to do things that don't seem terribly questionable, using an intermediary, of course. Then eventually hit them with the knowledge that their actions have doomed the kingdom that they belong to fall under the sway of the blue dragon tyrant who lives next door. This puts them on the dragon's radar from day one, but makes them useful pawns in its schemes instead of targets to be obliterated. And they'll stay that way until they get too big for their britches and things get ugly. Good times, good times. Because blue dragons have high CRs and adult and ancient dragons are the most fun for the DM to run and the players to encounter, you're going to want to make sure that you have a campaign that is going to last long enough for your group to reach this threat. So with that in mind, don't forget to check out this next video. It'll teach you the 3-plot method for creating campaigns that last all the way from level 1 to level 20. In the meantime, here's a little of what my cats have been up to because they're the tyrants in my life. See you in the next video. He's too quiet.